Gillen was able to capture a cutter, a privateer, the brig Venus, and 7 other vessels, which he sent to Havana. Now remember, the Duke of Luxembourg was entitled to 25% of all of those ships.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are again with our friend Harold Gonzales, who will be talking about the South Carolina Navy and its history of cooperation with the Spanish forces during the American Revolution. Harold is a retired lieutenant colonel of the U.S. Air Force. He has a doctorate in psychology from Argosy University, and he is a member of the SAR, not only in Louisiana, but in South Carolina, where he is the secretary of the chapter in Sumter, South Carolina. Harold, thanks for coming on board with us again. Tell us about this story that is not really told. I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more about the South Carolina Navy.
Well, thank you for having me, and good morning to everyone. A lot of people don't realize, but of the 13 colonies, only 3 had what we would consider blue water navies, and that was South Carolina, Massachusetts, and New York, which, by the way, are the 3 richest colonies. Today we're going to talk about several of the individual ships and some of the leadership of the South Carolina Navy. But I think first it's interesting to note that the current U.S. Constitution does not allow the states to have a Navy, the National Guards or Army. But under the Articles of Confederation, the different states could form their own navies, which gave the state the right to have this navy. The South Carolina Navy was supposed to mainly protect Charleston. And the types of ships, I'll just name a few of them. The South Carolina Navy had frigates. One was named Rattlesnake, one was Berkeley, and the Truty all had 26 guns. Now, all of these ships were acquired from the French. It also had the brig Notre Dame and the Comet and the General Moultrie, which were 20-gun ships. Berkeley, Truty, Notre Dame, and General Moultrie all were part of the defense of Charleston in early 1780. Berkeley was built in France, and actually she was built in 1764. In 1779, she sank in the Savannah River under French command, but was refloated, and then the French gave her to the South Carolina government. Another of the ships that defended Charleston was the 44-gun frigate Berkeley, which they wanted to make into a floating battery to defend Charleston Harbor, but they felt she couldn't stand up to the British, which had much larger ships and guns. So she was actually sunk in front of Charleston to try to impede the British vessels from entering Charleston Harbor. The Truty, again, was a French vessel which was built in 1777 and was transferred to the South Carolina Navy in December of 1779. And by March 1780, she was a frigate with 26 guns. But again, in the defense of Charleston, they sunk her in the Cooper River to prevent the British squadron from sailing up the river and to the port of Charleston. After Saratoga, you have to remember, when the British strategy changed to focusing on the South, the British were able to commit much larger ships to the South. And I think that's why the Berkeley and the Truty were both sunk to prevent the entrance into the harbor. Now, if you know anything about Civil War history, this is exactly what the Union did with the Ghost Fleet that they sank off of Charleston to try to impede the gun runners from coming into Charleston Harbor. The Notre Dame and the General Moultrie were destroyed after Charleston was captured by the British. And if you read most history books, they go, and the South Carolina no longer had a base, and for the remainder of the war was not very effective. Well, that's not necessarily true. And that's what we're going to talk about now. A patriot you may have never heard of is Commodore Alexander Gillen. Gillen was born August the 13th, 1741 in Rotterdam, Dutch Republic, to Scottish parents, and was educated in London and lived there for a period of time. He became a sea captain and sailed the brigantine Surprise to Charleston in 1765. While in Charleston, Gillen was lucky enough to marry Mary Cripps, who was a widow from Kent living in Charleston. And through her wealth, which was extensive, Gillen formed what was called the Cripps and Gillen Enterprises, which was a large business, and in some references, it was the largest business in Charleston before the American Revolution. He was elected a delegate to the Second Provincial Congress of South Carolina in 1775 and 1776, and was a member of the First General Assembly in 1776. His men elected him captain of the German Fusiliers of Charleston in May of 1775, but 3 years later, the South Carolina legislature appointed him Commodore of the South Carolina State Navy and sent him to France to procure vessels for the Navy. He also was the first, you probably have never seen this flag, but the ensign of the South Carolina Navy is 13 stripes of red and blue with a rattlesnake stretched out across the flag diagonally with "Don't Tread on Me" written on the flag.
Right there for our listeners, we're not talking about the Gadsden flag, although it looks very similar to that. We're talking about a different colored flag with the "Don't Tread on Me" and the rattlesnake on it.
That's correct. And yesterday at Gillen's, the marking of his grave, a naval historian said the reason that the snake is stretched out rather than curled like the Gadsden flag is because the snake is swimming.
Ah, I gotcha.
So that's why they built or they designed the flag as they did. Now, while Gillen was in Europe trying to procure ships, in 1780 he was able to charter l'Indien from the Duke of Luxembourg on behalf of the South Carolina Navy. Now, as in many things that were going on in Europe at this time, the Duke of Luxembourg was actually in negotiations with John Paul Jones. This was the ship that John Paul Jones wanted. But the Duke of Luxembourg did not want to antagonize the British by giving a ship to the Americans. So he worked out a deal with Gillen. Now, the problem with that is, remember, this is a charter. So therefore, the Duke of Luxembourg was entitled to a quarter share of any prizes that Gillen captured. Unfortunately for Gillen, not only did he have to pledge the trust and faith of the state of South Carolina to pay these debts, but he also put up his personal wealth which was extensive for the time, as collateral for this ship. In 1781, Gillen renamed La Indienne the South Carolina, manned by American officers and a group of European seamen and Marines, and they sailed toward Charleston. Unfortunately, en route, he discovered that the city had been captured. So he sailed to Havana, Cuba. Now, I have a belief that the South Carolina Navy had always planned, if Charleston fell, to assemble in Havana. And if you think about it, it's logical. Now, I guess they could have gone to St. Augustine, but Havana was definitely a better port for them to reconstitute their navy. Between August and October of 1781, on his voyage back to the United States, or at that time to the colonies, Gillen was able to capture a cutter, a privateer, the brig Venus, and 7 other vessels, which he sent to Havana. Now remember, the Duke of Luxembourg was entitled to 25% of all of those ships. Okay? So just to refresh the timeline for the people listening, remember, Spain did not declare war until August of 1779. And Galvez, who we've talked about before, but we're going to talk about again here, in September of 1779, Galvez captured Fort Butte, and then in September of 1779, he captured Baton Rouge. And at the same time, the British surrendered Natchez. So Spain now controlled the east and west banks of the Mississippi all the way to St. Louis. In 1780, in March, Galvez captured Mobile, and then in May the 12th, 1780, Charleston fell. So you can see that Galvez's campaign is running parallel and in opposition to the British actions that are taking place in South Carolina. In May the 10th, 1781, Galvez captured Pensacola. Now, most people don't realize this, but remember, after the French and Indian War, the British actually had 15 colonies in North America. They had the 13 original colonies, and they had West Florida and East Florida as the 14th and 15th colonies. So when Galvez captured Pensacola, in essence, the British lost one of their colonies. They lost West Florida.
Well, let me stop you right there just for my benefit. So that was May 10th, 1780?
1781.
1781. Okay.
1781.
Okay.
And then, of course, the capture of Yorktown took place on October the 19th, 1781. Now, most history books say, okay, de Grasse defeated the British fleet, and that was the end of operations in the Americas. And then in 83, they signed a peace treaty. Well, that's not true. As a matter of fact, most of the naval activity that took place during the American Revolution took place after the fall of Yorktown up until the peace treaty. Now, after Galvez captured Pensacola, he went to the Caribbean. His uncle, who was the minister of the Andes, Jose de Galvez, commanded all the military forces in the Caribbean. And Bernardo Galvez's initial plan was he wanted to simultaneously invade Jamaica and the Bahamas so that the Spanish would take away all of the British assets in the Caribbean. For the Bahamas expedition, since Galvez couldn't be in two places at one time, he appointed Juan Manuel de Cagala as the commander-in-chief of the operation. Okay? Now remember, the attack on Nassau and the Bahamas was going to be about 600 kilometers from Havana. So they definitely needed a large naval presence to do this. Well, the interesting thing is, Cagala looked around Havana Harbor, and guess who was there? The South Carolina, with Commodore Alexander Gillen in command, and he had 8 small combat ships. Now, I believe those were either part of the original Carolina Navy or some of the ships he had captured, that Gillen had captured on the way back to Charleston. So you have really 9 combat ships and 12 transports that were part of the South Carolina Navy that joined Cagala for the attack on the Bahamas. Now, unfortunately, again, because Spain did not recognize the United States as a separate country, they had to reach a financial agreement for Gillen to, and of course, Gillen has a chartered ship from the Duke of Luxembourg, so they reached a monetary agreement for Gillen to support the Spanish invasion of Nassau, which leads to problems later on. Okay? Now, Gillen, from his time as a sea captain before the Revolution, was very familiar with the waters around the Bahamas and actually knew the little navigated Northwest Channel to New Providence, which would offer an opportunity for a surprise attack. The conquest of Nassau was important because once captured, it would be an excellent observation point for the movement of British ships, especially any attack that the British would try to have on Havana. And that made the capture of the Bahamas doubly important to the Spanish. Okay? But then again, the world changes. Okay? Again, most history books say de Grasse defeated the British when they tried to break the siege of Yorktown, and that was the end of the British fleet. Wrong. Okay, between April 9th and April the 12th of 1782, Sir George Rodney defeated the French fleet under de Grasse in what is called the Battle of the Santes, which was fought off of Guadalupe Island. And actually, the British had 33 ships against the French 30 ships. So the Battle of the Santes helped bring the American War of Independence to a conclusion that was more favorable to the British because they had defeated the French fleet. Galvez had already started to sail for Jamaica for the invasion with a total of 6,000 men and 80 transport ships. But when he heard that Rodney had defeated de Grasse, he was depending on de Grasse's fleet to be his naval support to capture Jamaica. And Galvez knew that Rodney would immediately move to defend Jamaica from any incursion. Okay? So, did he cancel the entire project? No. Galvez still ordered Cagala to attack the Bahamas since he had a sizable fleet defended by the South Carolina and the other warships of the South Carolina Navy. So they set off to attack the Bahamas. The invasion force had 2,500 Marines and Spanish soldiers, but due to the hurricane in north of the Bahamas, okay, they set sail on the morning of April the 22nd, 1782, but were not able to make much headway because of the unfavorable winds. So it was not until May the 2nd that Gillen was able to reach the Bimini Islands in the Straits of Florida. 80 kilometers north of the Bimini Islands, Gillen actually detected, headed toward South Carolina to make sure that reinforcements weren't coming from Charleston. And on May the 3rd, a British vessel was spotted on the horizon, and Gillen chased it down because he did not want the news to get to Charleston that there was an invasion of the Bahamas coming. So after a short skirmish, the British commander was forced to surrender, and they discovered that on March the 20th, artillery and troop reinforcements had arrived at the Bahamas, at New Providence, from Charleston in 3 transport ships escorted by war frigates. But undaunted, they continued toward the Bahamas, even with that bad news. And on the morning of May the 6th, the expedition dropped anchor between Hog Island and Salt Clay, and Gillen sighted and captured 2 more enemy ships in the channel. Kagala reconnoitered the coasts of Hog Island to find a suitable place for landing, and sent his lieutenant colonel of the Aragon Infantry Regiment, Francisco Miranda, to confer with Nassau, who was commanded by Vice Admiral John Maxwell, the British governor of the Bahamas. Maxwell ended up surrendering without a fight, and Kagala, on behalf of Spain, signed the capitulation of the Bahamas on Hog Island with Maxwell. And basically, Great Britain had lost the Bahamas to the Spanish, and this coincided with the anniversary of Galvez taking Pensacola a year earlier. Now, we need to talk about the fate of 2 of the principal adversaries in our story, okay? The South Carolina, the ship, after the Bahamas, Gillen sailed her to Philadelphia and remained there for 6 months because the British were blockading Philadelphia. Unfortunately for Gillen, the Duke of Luxembourg sent creditors to seize the ship because he had not been paid what he believed he was owed for lending the ship to the Americans. So on 20 December 1782, while she was attempting to dash out of Philadelphia through the British blockade, she ran into a squadron of 3 British frigates. Now, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself, so let me, the creditors from the Duke of Luxembourg assembled to seize the ship, and Gillen was dismissed as the commander of the South Carolina and was replaced by Captain John Joyner. On December the 20th, 1782, Joyner, probably with pressure from the Duke of Luxembourg, attempted to dash out of Philadelphia, and 3 blockading British ships took chase after the South Carolina. They chased it for 18 hours, and in the Battle of the Delaware River, or the Delaware Capes, as it's called, the South Carolina was actually captured, and the ship was lost to the British under Joyner's command, not under Gillen's command.
So those 466 men that were captured, and I would imagine several of them were killed or wounded. Were they the South Carolina Marines, or?
No, well, remember, the South Carolina was officered by Americans, but the crew were European.
I see. Okay.
In nature.
Okay.
And the actual numbers, the crew had 466 men who were captured, of whom she had already lost 6 killed and 8 wounded. And the British suffered no casualties in the Battle of the Delaware Capes. Now came the problem of how to pay the Duke of Luxembourg, okay, and how to collect the money that the Spanish had offered Gillen to support the invasion. None of that had been settled. It took 10 years in May of 1784 for the United States Congress to approve a resolution in favor of the South Carolina delegation requesting compensation from Spain for the services rendered by its Navy during the conquest of Nassau. Upon learning of this matter, the King of Spain, Charles III, acknowledged the problem, but no money was received. But he did send a gift of 2 Zamoran donkeys to George Washington, which I guess Zamoran donkeys were very much appreciated in the state, in the colonies. Okay. The Chevalier de Luxembourg pressed his claims against the state, which were not settled until 1855, for $65,000, a mere fraction of the ship's true cost. Now,
what did Gillen get out of all this?
Well, that's the problem. Gillen, as we'll talk about probably in the next segment, he ended up passing away before all of this was settled. Unfortunately, talking yesterday with his descendants, because he not only had pledged the resources of the state of South Carolina, he also had pledged his personal resources, and his grandchildren lost the plantation, Gillen's Retreat, to the creditors to pay for, I assume, this $65,000, which the state of South Carolina did not pay. And I'm still trying to find enough information to try to verify that. But the interesting thing is the Brick family ended up with Gillen's Retreat, which was the plantation. He is buried next to Alexander Gillen in the cemetery on the old original plantation. And it was interesting that yesterday many of his descendants were also in attendance at the grave marking. So obviously the plantation changed hands to the Brick family, but I have no idea exactly what the legality was that caused it to do that.
Where is this plantation?
It's actually, the best way to tell you is, if you know where Fort Mott is, right. It's about Fort Mott, where the Revolutionary War battle took place. It's near St. Matthews, and the plantation is, or where it was located, is about 30 miles to the west of St. Matthews.
Going into Orangeburg County?
Yes. It was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there was a little church that we held the ceremony at, and then we ran in the woods, literally, for about 5 miles. Now, the nice thing is the America 250 Commission owns the land where the cemetery is.
I see.
The rest of the plantation property was just recently sold. So the right of way is maintained to get into the cemetery, but the actual land that the plantation owned back then was all transferred just recently to a private owner.
Sounds like a good place for us to stop on this episode, and we'll pick up again in a few minutes